When we speak of war, the mind fills with the sound of gunfire, the crash of tanks, and the image of men marching through smoke. But behind every army and every victory, there were others, women, whose courage rarely reached the pages of history. Names like Claudia Vilor, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and Nancy Wake have been reduced to faint echoes, buried under the noise of generals and glory. Yet without them, the war itself might have taken a very different turn. Across continents, women became the silent machinery that kept nations alive. They stepped into uniforms, workshops, hospitals, and decoding rooms not for recognition, but for necessity. While men bled on battlefields, women held together the crumbling structure of society. They repaired aircraft, drove supply trucks, nursed the wounded, and intercepted enemy communications. They became the heartbeat of the war effort, their strength disguised as duty. Claudia Vilor was one of them, a communications officer on the Eastern Front who spent sleepless nights decoding intercepted German signals. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, but her precision saved entire regiments from ambush. Yet her name never appeared in reports. When peace came, her records were buried under signatures belonging to men. History celebrated the soldiers who fought, not the women who made their victories possible. But time has a way of remembering what history forgets. And the stories of women like Claudia Vilor still wait, buried beneath dust, to be told in full truth. Before the war, Claudia Vilor was a school teacher in a quiet town, far removed from politics or power. She lived simply, teaching children to read and write, her world defined by chalk dust and laughter. But when the thunder of war reached her doorstep, her life transformed overnight. In 1941, she volunteered for the Signal Corps, fluent in several languages and gifted in analysis. Her skill quickly drew attention, and she was stationed near the Eastern Front to intercept German radio transmissions. Each day she sat hunched over coded messages, racing against time as artillery echoed in the distance. A single mistake could mean hundreds of lives lost. Through her careful work, countless Soviet positions avoided disaster. Yet when her reports reached higher command, her name disappeared. Male officers signed off her results and received the praise. Claudia remained invisible, her existence confined to classified documents. Still, she never complained. Her sense of duty outweighed her desire for recognition. She wrote once in her journal, "We fight not for medals, but for tomorrow." That tomorrow came, but it forgot her. After the war, she returned home to find her service erased, her records missing, her efforts unacknowledged. For many like her, the victory they had helped win became someone else's story. Their silence was not chosen. It was enforced by a world unwilling to accept women as heroes. But their quiet persistence continues to speak across time, defying erasure with dignity and truth. The war changed everything for women across the globe. In Britain, they filled the factories and farmlands. In America, they became welders, mechanics, and drivers. In the Soviet Union, they flew fighter planes and manned anti-aircraft guns. Everywhere, women were told they were only helping, yet they were the ones keeping the war machine alive. The phrase "Rosie the Riveter" became a symbol in the West, but behind that poster were real women who worked grueling shifts surrounded by heat, noise, and danger. They endured injuries, toxic fumes, and exhaustion while sending supplies to the front lines. In hospitals, nurses performed surgeries under bombardment, stitching wounds with trembling hands and little sleep. In resistance movements, women carried secret messages in loaves of bread, sabotaged enemy trains, and risked torture if discovered. Their courage was practical, relentless, and uncelebrated. And when the war finally ended, society demanded they disappear from the spotlight. They were told to return to the kitchen, to rebuild families, to be quiet again. Governments called it restoration. But for these women, it felt like exile. Their contribution had been needed only while the world was burning. Once the flames died down, they were pushed back into shadows. The world thanked them politely, then forgot them entirely. Their strength became invisible, their sacrifice rewritten, their legacy absorbed into silence. History often hides behind the pen of those who write it, and after the war, those pens were mostly held by men. The official stories of victory were told in offices and press rooms, far from the battlefields. They glorified generals, commanders, and politicians, all male, while women's names were quietly removed. It wasn't mere neglect. It was a decision shaped by politics and patriarchy. The image of the soldier returning home needed a devoted wife waiting by the window, not a fellow veteran sharing his scars. Women who had learned to lead, repair, and command were now told to forget. They were expected to trade their uniforms for aprons, their rifles for sewing needles. Posters that once urged them to serve now told them to smile and rebuild. Their competence became a threat to fragile traditions. And so the silence began, deliberate, calculated, and enduring. Claudia Vilor's reports were filed under a male officer's name. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was treated as an exception, not a representative of thousands. Nancy Wake's exploits were romanticized into myth rather than recorded as fact. The war had shown that women could fight, think, and endure as equals, but peace demanded they pretend otherwise. What followed was not just the end of conflict, but the beginning of erasure, a rewriting of history that transformed courage into curiosity and reality into rumor. Across Europe, the contributions of women took many forms. In France, they joined the underground resistance, smuggling weapons, sabotaging railways, and passing secret codes under the noses of German officers. Many were mothers and daughters who risked their lives daily without recognition or reward. They were couriers, nurses, and fighters who learned to move in silence. Among them was the young spy Nancy Wake, known to the Gestapo as the White Mouse. She organized resistance cells, coordinated supply drops from the Allies, and led attacks against German convoys deep within occupied France. Her leadership and bravery earned her the respect of every soldier she commanded. Yet after the war, she was treated more as an anomaly than a hero. Her name appeared in brief mentions, often surrounded by exaggeration and myth, as if her real achievements were too uncomfortable to fit into history's narrative. This was how many women's stories were handled, transformed into legend to hide the truth that they had been soldiers, not side characters. Their intelligence and courage disrupted the old order, and for that they were forgotten. They proved that heroism has no gender, yet society could not accept such a truth so soon after the smoke cleared. The silence that followed victory became another kind of battle, one not fought with bullets, but with memory. Farther east, the Soviet Union embraced women not as helpers, but as warriors. It was born out of necessity. The Red Army had lost millions of men, and the defense of the motherland required every capable hand. Women like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a sniper who became a legend, redefined what courage looked like. She was responsible for more than 300 confirmed kills and inspired both fear and admiration. Yet even she faced skepticism. When she toured Allied nations, she was asked more about her looks and love life than her achievements. She returned home disillusioned, realizing that even victory could not erase prejudice. Behind her were thousands of others: pilots of the Night Witches, female tank operators, medics who dragged the wounded from burning vehicles under fire. They served without hesitation and with unshakable loyalty. But when the war ended, most were dismissed, their uniforms taken, their ranks erased. The Soviet government celebrated victory while quietly pushing its heroines into domestic life. For decades, their photos were hidden in archives, their names missing from official accounts. The state honored the myth of the male soldier while the real story of its female defenders faded into dust. In Britain, women fought a quieter war. At Bletchley Park, Thousands of them sat in cramped rooms, deciphering enemy communications that shaped the outcome of battles. They worked in absolute secrecy, forbidden to discuss even the smallest detail with friends or family. Their tireless efforts cracked the German Enigma codes, shortening the war by years, yet almost none of their names appeared in history books. When the war ended, they were ordered to remain silent about their service under the Official Secrets Act. For decades, they lived ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary memories. Some never spoke a word until they were old, long after their work had saved millions. This was the cruel irony. They had helped win the war through intelligence and silence, and that same silence followed them into peace. Many of these women returned to find their positions gone, their stories unknown, their sacrifices unrecorded. The men they had supported rose to positions of honor. They themselves returned to anonymity. But their patience and discipline reflected something profound about courage, that it is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it hides in secrecy, in quiet rooms where victory is measured not in medals, but in messages broken before the enemy could act. In the United States, the face of women's war work was Rosie the Riveter, smiling confidently beneath her red bandana. But behind that image were millions of exhausted women laboring in factories filled with noise, heat, and danger. They built bombers, tanks, and ammunition by the thousands. Their hands were calloused, their lungs filled with dust and smoke. They endured long shifts, rationed food, and the constant fear that their sons or husbands might not return. Yet they never stopped. America's industrial might, the so-called arsenal of democracy, was powered largely by women. Without their work, production would have collapsed. But when the war ended, these same women were told to step aside. Posters that once called them heroes now told them to return home and make room for men. Many resisted, unwilling to give up their independence, but society was relentless. Advertisements began to shame working women, portraying them as selfish or unfeminine. Their brief moment of equality vanished beneath a tide of tradition. History would later remember the symbol of Rosie, but not the suffering or sacrifice of those who embodied her. Their stories remain locked in faded photographs, a silent reminder that wars are not won only by those who fight, but by those who never stop working. While the factories thundered in America, another quiet revolution unfolded in the Pacific and Europe. Women served as nurses on the front lines, where the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. They faced the same dangers as the men they treated, often without weapons or protection. Field hospitals were makeshift, tents pitched near artillery lines, lit only by flickering lanterns. These women performed surgeries under fire, bandaged soldiers, while bombs shook the ground and carried the wounded through mud and smoke. Many never made it home, dying anonymously in service. One nurse recalled how she stopped counting the men she treated because every number felt like another soul lost. Their courage was raw and human, not born from patriotism alone, but from compassion stronger than fear. When the war ended, these nurses were rarely mentioned in reports or ceremonies. Their names were missing from medals, their faces absent from newsreels. Yet every soldier who lived owed them a debt that could never be repaid. They were the ones who saw war not in maps or plans, but in the trembling hands they held as men slipped away. Theirs was a heroism of endurance, unseen, unrecorded, but unforgettable to those they saved. In occupied Poland, women's bravery reached an almost unimaginable level. They joined underground resistance movements, smuggled messages through sewers, and carried explosives disguised as food baskets. One such woman, Irina Sendler, saved more than 2,000 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto by sneaking them out under Nazi noses. She wrote each child's name on thin slips of paper, buried in jars beneath a tree, hoping to reunite families after the war. Captured and tortured, she never revealed a single name. Her story, like so many, remained buried for decades because the world preferred to celebrate the grand battles rather than the quiet defiance of compassion. These women resisted not with guns, but with courage, risking everything to protect life in a time when life had no value. Even after the war, their heroism was overshadowed by politics and propaganda. Irena lived in silence, working as a nurse again, never seeking fame. It was only near the end of her life that her deeds came to light, proving that even the smallest acts of mercy can echo louder than the sound of war. The women of Poland showed that resistance is not always about fighting back. Sometimes it is about refusing to let humanity die. The women of Germany lived through a different kind of war, one that turned inward. As their cities were bombed to rubble, they struggled to keep their families alive amid fear and hunger. Many worked in anti-aircraft crews, fire brigades, and hospitals, trying to save what was left of their homeland. Others, especially those forced into munitions factories, worked under brutal conditions for a regime that promised them glory but delivered despair. When the war ended, their suffering did not. They became the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who rebuilt cities from ashes with their bare hands. They carried bricks, cleared debris, and laid foundations where once there had been death. Yet even in defeat, their resilience shone. They restored not only buildings but dignity, proving that survival is its own form of victory. But official recognition rarely followed. Germany, burdened by guilt and ruin, wanted to forget everything tied to the war, including the women who had endured it. The rubble women became ghosts of the post-war streets, strong, silent, and invisible in history's pages. They remind us that sometimes the hardest battles begin after the war is over, when there is nothing left but broken stone and the will to stand again. Across the ocean, in the Pacific Theater, women played a vital but often forgotten role in intelligence and communications. They intercepted enemy radio transmissions, translated Japanese messages, and tracked naval movements in real time. Many were part of the wwii, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, serving in naval offices, cryptography rooms, and code units. Their accuracy and speed saved countless lives during the island campaigns, helping predict enemy ambushes and fleet movements. Yet their work was shrouded in secrecy, hidden under layers of classified reports. When the war ended, they were dismissed quietly, told their contributions were administrative. Some returned home to find no one believed the importance of what they had done. These women understood the war in numbers and whispers, in the tension of decoding one message before it was too late. They carried the burden of knowledge, secrets of death and survival, without recognition. Their calm under pressure rivaled any general's composure. But history, bound by its old rules, preferred to spotlight soldiers over signalers. The truth is, wars are won not only by those who fire the last shot, but also by those who hear the first signal. In the Soviet Union, women did not just support the war, they fought it head-on. The Red Army had over 800,000 women in service, from medics to snipers to pilots. Among them was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, one of the deadliest snipers in history, credited with over 300 confirmed kills. Her precision turned her into a legend among Soviet troops and a nightmare for the German army. Yet even she faced the same pattern after victory. When the guns fell silent, her achievements were minimized. Her name faded from memory outside of Russia. Like Claudia Vilor, she became a symbol of courage, rewritten as curiosity. But the Soviet women fought everywhere, flying in the night witches' squadrons, bombing enemy positions under the cover of darkness, repairing planes between raids. These were not passive helpers. They were warriors who mastered machinery and fear alike. They faced death not with screams, but with silence, discipline, and resolve. For every Pavlichenko known, thousands of others were forgotten, buried in the snows of Stalingrad and the forests of Belarus. They had fought because their homeland called them, not for fame or politics, but for survival itself. When the war ended, many returned to find their uniforms traded for aprons, their medals gathering dust in drawers. The world celebrated the victory, but not the women who helped secure it. Their story, like so many others, was edited to fit a narrative where heroes were only men. Far from the battlefronts, in secret laboratories and hidden code rooms, women shaped the course of modern warfare through intellect and mathematics. At Bletchley Park in Britain, thousands of women worked tirelessly to break the Enigma code, one of Germany's most powerful weapons. They were mathematicians, linguists, and analytical minds who turned chaos into pattern. Among them were figures like Joan Clark, who worked alongside Alan Turing, solving complex ciphers that shortened the war by years. Yet, their brilliance was buried under classifications and gender bias. When the war ended, many of these women were sworn to secrecy, unable even to tell their families what they had done. Their contribution remained invisible, their intelligence dismissed as clerical work. But behind those closed doors, they were decoding the enemy's mind, intercepting plans that saved thousands of lives. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with logic, patience, and courage. They worked through exhaustion, their hands ink-stained from endless streams of intercepted messages. Each mistake could mean disaster, and yet they persevered. The irony remains that the world celebrated the machine, but not the women who mastered it. For decades, history treated them as assistants, not architects of victory. Only recently have their names begun to emerge, proving that the war's greatest victories were often achieved in silence by those who never saw the battlefield, but changed it forever. In France, women's defiance became the heartbeat of the resistance. They operated in shadows, smuggling weapons, forging documents, and passing coded messages hidden in loaves of bread or hems of dresses. One of the most fearless was Lucy Albrecht, a history teacher turned resistance leader who organized daring escapes for captured fighters. Her calm intellect and fierce bravery helped dismantle entire Nazi operations. Yet her story, like many others, was often overshadowed by male counterparts. Claudia Vilor's name might have faded, but the spirit she embodied lived on in these women who refused to yield. They lived double lives, mothers by day, spies by night, never knowing if the next knock at the door would be their last. For them, the war was not just about nations, but about humanity itself. They risked everything to preserve the idea of freedom, to ensure their children would not grow up in chains. Their courage wasn't born from glory, but from necessity. After liberation, these women were praised briefly, then pushed aside as men reclaimed authority. Their heroism was transformed into anecdotes, their sacrifices diluted into romantic myths. Yet history cannot hide forever what courage reveals. These women fought without medals or armies, armed only with faith and fire. They proved that resistance begins in the heart, in the decision to say no when the world demands silence. Across Asia, women fought in wars of independence intertwined with World War II. In China, they served in the resistance against Japanese occupation, enduring famine, violence, and loss with unimaginable resilience. In the Philippines, guerrilla fighters like Nieves Fernandez led ambushes in the jungles, teaching men how to fight and survive. She once said, "I kill only because I must," a reflection of how deeply war changed what it meant to be human. These women, often armed with little more than courage and old rifles, became the protectors of villages and families when no one else could. They were not trained soldiers, yet their willpower turned fear into strength. After the war, many of them were forgotten, their names reduced to footnotes, or left untranslated in history books. Their courage existed outside the Western lens of recognition, and so it faded quietly into memory. But in the faces of their descendants, in the stories whispered by elders, their defiance lives on. They remind us that heroism does not depend on rank, gender, or recognition. It exists wherever people stand up against impossible odds. The women of Asia fought wars within wars, for freedom, survival, and dignity. And though history overlooked them, their legacy remains written in the soil they defended. In America, the war effort reached into every household, and women became the backbone of the nation's industrial might. They worked in factories that never slept, welding steel, assembling aircraft, and producing ammunition. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of pride, but behind that poster were millions of real women whose hands built the machinery that kept the Allies fighting. They lifted heavy engines, endured burns, and stood through 12-hour shifts, while letters from the front reminded them why they worked. These women weren't soldiers, but their labor powered every victory. When the tanks rolled into Berlin or the planes soared over Normandy, they carried the fingerprints of these silent workers. Yet, when the war ended, the same hands that built victory were told to let go of their tools. Many were dismissed as men returned home, their contributions reframed as temporary acts of duty. Newspapers called them heroines, but history called them housewives again. Their strength, their endurance, and their skill were pushed back into the shadows. But the legacy of those factory floors, of smoke, sweat, and unity, reshaped the idea of what women could do. They proved that victory was not just won on the battlefield, but in every forge, every workshop, and every heart that refused to give in to despair. In Germany, the story of women during the war took on a darker and more complex path. Under Nazi rule, women were told their duty was to serve the Reich through motherhood and obedience. Yet as the war dragged on and men fell by the millions, they were forced into roles once denied to them. Women became clerks, signal operators, and even anti-aircraft gunners. In the final months of the war, young girls manned defense lines as the Third Reich crumbled. Among them were those like Claudia Vilor, whose quiet defiance came not through loyalty to ideology, but through survival and conscience. Many German women found themselves trapped between duty and disbelief, working to save lives while witnessing the regime's collapse from within. They patched soldiers' wounds, buried the dead, and fed the starving even as bombs fell over their cities. Some secretly helped prisoners or smuggled food to those condemned by the system. Their war was one of silent rebellion, small acts of humanity in a time of horror. After the fall of Berlin, many of them faced humiliation, loss, and silence. Their nation wanted to forget, to erase the shame. But even among ruin, their compassion and courage endured, reminders that even in the darkest regimes, there were those who chose decency over doctrine. While Europe and America rebuilt, the women who had risked everything were often erased in the process of reconstruction. Governments wanted to restore order, and that meant returning society to its old hierarchies. In Britain, thousands of women who had served in uniform were dismissed without ceremony. Their uniforms were taken, their names removed from active records. In the Soviet Union, returning female soldiers were told to marry quickly and forget the battlefield. In France, resistance fighters were ignored in post-war parades. Even in victory, women were defeated by silence. Claudia Vilor's story reflects this injustice perfectly. Her service reports, once filled with brilliance and accuracy, were archived under male officers' names. The files credited men who never handled a single transmission. This bureaucratic theft was not accidental. It was deliberate erasure to protect fragile egos and restore control. The world could celebrate women as symbols of endurance, but not as equals in strength and intellect. The contradiction defined post-war life. Societies that had needed women's courage now demanded their obedience. Yet, deep down, something had changed forever. The war had unlocked a strength that could not be fully contained again. Those women might have gone silent, but their silence carried power, the kind that shapes generations to come. In the quiet years that followed, the memories of those who served began to fade, but history leaves traces that cannot be erased. Letters discovered in attics, faded photographs, and diaries written by candlelight began to tell a different version of the war, one where women were not merely spectators, but participants. Claudia Vilor's intercepted communications, found decades later in dusty archives, revealed how crucial her work had been in saving Allied lives. Her calculations predicted German ambush that changed the course of battles, yet her name appeared nowhere in the official summaries. Historians now understand that this pattern repeated across nations. Women whose intelligence, bravery, and sacrifice were quietly absorbed into male-dominated records. It was not that their stories lacked importance, but that their existence challenged the myth of male-only heroism. For decades, these truths lay buried under medals and myths. But as historians dig deeper, these women's voices return, like echoes from another time. Their stories remind us that history is not fixed. It evolves as we uncover what was hidden. Each recovered letter, each decoded message, is not just evidence, it is justice. The war that tried to silence women now speaks through their forgotten words. The rediscovery of women like Claudia Vilor began not through governments or institutions, but through individuals, historians, families, and curious researchers who stumbled upon forgotten records. A student in Prague once found her name on a decrypted radio log hidden among faded ink and military jargon. That simple discovery unraveled a larger truth, that Claudia had been responsible for coordinating one of the most critical communication networks on the Eastern Front. Her precision and analytical mind had saved hundreds of soldiers from walking into traps. Yet for decades, no monument bore her name. No medal bore her face. This story, however, was not unique. Similar tales emerged from Poland, Italy, and Norway, where women had risked everything to keep intelligence flowing, supply chains working, and hope alive. The silence surrounding their achievements was not due to oversight. It was systemic neglect, shaped by societies that feared shifting the balance of power. To admit women had shaped victory meant admitting that old hierarchies had failed. So instead, history bent itself into a convenient narrative. But truth has gravity. As time passes, these stories are resurfacing, forcing the world to reckon with what it chose to forget. The ghosts of these women do not haunt, they teach. They remind us that courage is not owned by gender, nor confined to uniforms. It is born wherever people choose to act when the world needs them most. In the United States, a similar rediscovery took shape as historians examined the hidden workforce of the Manhattan Project and military communications. Thousands of women, often labeled as secretaries or assistants, were in fact solving advanced equations, constructing early computers, and maintaining the precision that nuclear research demanded. They worked long hours without acknowledgement, often unaware of the full scope of what they were building. Many believed they were assembling parts for the war effort, not the atomic bomb that would change history forever. Their skill, attention, and discipline made the impossible possible. Yet when the war ended, their names were left off reports, their photographs uncaptioned. Some died without ever knowing how vital their work had been. This silence reflected a pattern brilliance hidden behind bureaucracy. Claudia Vilor's forgotten transmissions in Europe mirrored the uncredited calculations of women in Los Alamos. Across continents, women had turned science and logic into weapons of defense, but their reward was erasure. Today, as declassified archives reveal their signatures on technical blueprints and research memos, their legacy finally gains voice. It is a reminder that progress often stands on the shoulders of the overlooked. The story of the 20th century's greatest conflicts cannot be told truthfully without them. Outside the laboratories and offices, the war's emotional battlefield left a different kind of scar. The women who had seen and done the unthinkable often carried their trauma in silence. Many had held dying comrades, faced enemy interrogations, or endured bombings without breaking. But when peace came, society offered no place for their pain. They were told to forget, to return to families, to smile for photographs that no longer felt real. Claudia Vilor's letters, written after the war, speak of sleepless nights, of guilt over messages she could not send in time, of comrades lost in the noise of static. Her words echoed countless others, women who fought wars not just against enemies but against memory. Their silence was not weakness. It was survival. They buried their suffering to protect their families from the horrors they had endured. Psychologists now recognize that the same trauma men faced in trenches lived quietly inside these women. They were veterans in all but name. Yet the medals, pensions, and ceremonies passed them by. They aged into anonymity, their stories reduced to whispers shared at kitchen tables. Only now, decades later, their diaries and recorded interviews reveal the cost of courage. They remind us that even victories carry ghosts, and that remembrance is its own act of justice. Across continents, the shared thread of these women's stories is resilience, an unyielding refusal to vanish despite history's attempt to forget them. Whether in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, they had carried nations on their backs while the world tore itself apart. Claudia Vilor's name stands among thousands whose strength transcended borders. Each coded message, each rebuilt bridge, each act of defiance contributed to a greater, unseen victory. The war ended, but their influence rippled into the decades that followed. They inspired new generations of women to study science, to lead armies, to enter politics, to demand equality. The silence that once hid them became the soil from which progress grew. Even though their photographs remain in monochrome, their impact colors the present. To remember them is not to rewrite history, but to restore it, to bring balance to a story that has been one-sided for too long. They were not ghosts or footnotes. They were the foundation upon which the modern world was rebuilt. When we speak their names now, we do not resurrect the past. We honor the truth that was always there. The victory they helped create was not only military, but human. Proof that courage has many faces, and that history, once silenced, always finds a voice again. As the post-war years unfolded, the world shifted its attention toward rebuilding cities and economies, but the human stories often stayed buried beneath the rubble. The women who had fought in silence began new lives, some as teachers, some as mothers, and others as quiet wanderers haunted by what they had witnessed. Claudia Vilor moved to Vienna, where she lived in a small apartment surrounded by books and radio parts, fragments of the world she once helped command. She never spoke of the war publicly, but neighbors recalled hearing faint Morse code tapping late into the night, as if she still sought someone lost across the static. Around her, Europe rebuilt. Skyscrapers rose where bunkers once stood, and people rushed to forget. But forgetting came at a price. Without stories like Claudia's, future generations risked inheriting only half the truth. The official histories described battles, treaties, and generals, yet they rarely described the soft persistence of women who refused to let chaos consume order. As time passed, historians began piecing together the overlooked half of that truth. They found that for every general with a map, there had been a woman with a message, a nurse with a torch, a worker with unwavering resolve. Their heroism was quiet, but without it, the war might have ended very differently. By the 1960s, the memories of the Second World War had begun to fade into documentaries, classroom lessons, and memorial parades. Yet beneath the surface, personal stories began surfacing in letters, interviews, and family attics. Claudia Vilor's surviving notebook was discovered by her niece, filled with codes, frequencies, and fragments of untransmitted messages. One note read, "Silence was never my choice." That single sentence spoke for an entire generation of forgotten women. Across Europe, similar discoveries took place: hidden diaries, torn photographs, and medals tucked away in wooden boxes. Each object carried the weight of an untold story. Museums slowly began displaying them, but it was not enough. The truth of what these women achieved could not fit behind glass. It had to be spoken, retold, shared with the emotion it deserved. As these accounts emerged, Historians realized that the narrative of war itself had to expand. War was not only fought with weapons, but with endurance, intellect, and compassion. The women who carried those traits had fought in their own quiet revolution. They proved that courage was not loud, nor limited to the battlefield. It could exist in a whisper, in a radio transmission, in a moment of defiance. Their rediscovery was not merely historical correction, it was moral restoration. As historians dug deeper, they began to see a pattern that stretched beyond wartime, a cycle where women's achievements were celebrated briefly, then forgotten until rediscovered by the next generation. The story of Claudia Vilor symbolized that pattern perfectly. Her work had saved soldiers, influenced battles, and yet her name disappeared from official archives. It took 70 years for her contribution to be acknowledged publicly. The same story echoed in Japan, the Soviet Union, and Britain, where women had operated machines, encrypted communications, and led resistance cells, all without recognition. In Britain, the women of Bletchley Park cracked the uncrackable, but secrecy laws kept their brilliance silent for decades. In the Soviet Union, female snipers outshot their male counterparts, yet their records were buried in bureaucracy. The truth is that history often reflects not what happened, but what people choose to remember. The rediscovery of these women is a reminder that memory itself is a battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with time. Every letter found, every diary published, is another victory against forgetting. The past may be unchangeable, but the way we tell it is not. When we tell it honestly, every hidden name becomes a monument, every rediscovered voice an act of justice. The story of Claudia Vilor, once just a whisper in the static of forgotten archives, now stands as a symbol of resilience that transcends her era. Her journey reminds us that history is not a collection of facts, but a living echo of choices, of people who dared to do what was right when the world demanded silence. Claudia's courage was not born from power, but from purpose. In her hands, a simple radio became a weapon of truth. Through her, we see how one person's resolve can outlast governments, wars, and time itself. Every transmission she sent was more than a signal. It was a declaration that humanity survives through connection. And today, as historians and storytellers revive her legacy, her signal continues to travel, not through airwaves, but through generations. The rediscovery of her life reminds us that courage never truly disappears. It only waits to be found again. For every Claudia Vilor, there are thousands more whose names history has misplaced. Their stories, once buried, are beginning to rise, forming a chorus of remembrance. When we listen closely, we realize they were never silent. We were simply not listening. In the quiet corners of museums and archives, the legacy of women like Claudia Vilor continues to take shape. Each document uncovered, each photograph restored, adds another missing piece to the vast puzzle of wartime truth. But what truly matters is not the documents themselves. It is the acknowledgement, the simple act of saying, "She mattered." For decades, entire generations grew up believing that wars were won solely by generals and armies. Only now are they beginning to see the invisible hands that held those victories together. The operators in dimly lit rooms, the medics who never slept, the couriers who carried messages through enemy lines, they formed the veins of resistance and survival. Claudia's name now appears in exhibitions, sometimes small, sometimes central, but always symbolic. Her story reminds us that the fight for recognition is as important as the fight for freedom itself. Because without recognition, history remains incomplete, and the courage of half its heroes fades into silence. Through storytelling, documentaries, and films, her life is finally speaking again, not loudly, but clearly. And in that clarity lies redemption for all those forgotten voices that once whispered through the noise of war. As more stories like Claudia Vilor's emerge, they reshape not only how we remember the past, but how we define heroism. The idea that bravery belongs to soldiers alone has begun to fade, replaced by an understanding that courage wears many faces. In the smoke and fire of World War II, some fought with rifles, while others fought with signals, code, and silence. Women like Claudia proved that strength could exist without spectacle, and victory could come from intellect as much as endurance. In a sense, they waged two wars, one against tyranny and another against invisibility. And though the guns fell silent in 1945, that second war never truly ended. Even today, women around the world continue to fight for recognition in fields once dominated by men. Claudia's life stands as a quiet warning that history can erase anyone who does not fit its preferred image. But her rediscovery shows that truth cannot stay buried forever. Every recovered name challenges the old myth that only one kind of bravery is worth remembering. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy she left behind. A reminder that real heroism is not in being seen, but in doing what must be done, even when no one is watching. In classrooms and documentaries, the new generation is beginning to ask different questions about the past. They no longer want only to know how the war was won, but who was forgotten in the process. Teachers show photographs of factory workers and nurses, explaining that wars are fought not only by those on the front lines, but also by those who held nations together behind them. The story of Claudia Vilor often appears in these lessons now, standing as a bridge between silence and recognition. Her dedication, like that of millions of others, reveals the depth of human resilience. These women worked without the promise of medals or glory, driven only by duty and conscience. When they were told they couldn't, they simply did. In a world still learning how to value unseen labor, their stories are more than history. They are lessons for the present. Because recognition is not about vanity, it is about truth. When young people hear about Claudia's life, they see that change is possible, even in the smallest acts. Her coded transmissions may have been brief, but their meaning still echoes, proof that courage, once released into the world, never truly fades. Now, as time carries the last witnesses of World War II into history, the duty to remember falls to us. The story of Claudia Vilor and countless others reminds us that remembrance is not about nostalgia, it is about justice. To speak their names is to restore what silence once erased. Every nation has its hidden heroines, and each deserves more than a footnote. They deserve their place in the story of humanity's survival. Claudia's quiet defiance, her loyalty, and her brilliance turned the course of countless lives, even if she never knew it. Her story tells us that change often begins in the shadows, where no one is watching, and that real strength is measured not by recognition, but by resolve. When we look back on wars, we should not only count victories and losses, but the hearts that refuse to break under pressure. The war ended decades ago, but its lessons are alive, especially the lesson that no contribution is too small, and no voice should ever again be silenced by history. In honoring Claudia Vilor, we honor them all, the women who fought, who worked, who endured, and who proved that courage has no gender.